Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about Kislev in patch 4.0 Shadows of Change DLC. Now I've already talked about the major changes, or lack thereof, of those changes in patch 4.0 for Kislev. Essentially what they've done for Kislev is they've changed the terrain to an extent over here in Kislev. It isn't as big of a major change as it was, say, for the Darklands, but they have changed the terrain, they've added provincial capitals, and beyond that, they have removed the devotion cost for all buildings. Now, I have a feeling that the reason they did this is because of how this affects Mother Stanka, because she doesn't use devotion in her campaign. But no Kislev structures, including the landmarks in the special Kislev cities, cost devotion anymore. Now, the issue with devotion has always been that you require a significant amount, and you can only gain it by fighting chaos. And you do want to always have an invocation effect on. You also need it mandatory for the supporter system. Some people would say, well, the problem with devotion, the real problem with devotion is the issue that you just, in the late game, you end up with a significant amount of devotion and nothing to spend it on. That is true, but I don't much care about the late game of Total War. I think that late game of Total War is overall, regardless of who you're playing as, which race you're playing as, which faction you're playing as, it's not really well designed. That is an overall issue, and I do think it should be addressed. I think when you're talking about balance issues, faction issues, lord issues, all that, it is important to focus more on the early game. So I'm talking here up to turn 60, and even then I'm pushing it. You can win the vast majority of campaigns as any legendary lords by turn like 30, 40. In the case of very strong legendary lords, by turn 20, even, like Grimgor, for instance. Actually, I think Grimgor can win his campaign by like turn 10, if you're playing that correctly. And by winning a campaign, I'm not talking about achieving the victory conditions. I'm talking about reaching a point where you genuinely cannot lose that campaign. So, focusing on the early game is more important, and the escalating devotion cost is an issue as I see it. But one of the biggest issues that Kislev has had since the launch of the game, not the launch of Immortal Empires, the launch of the game, is that they're supposed to be the Bulwark of the North. They're supposed to be the defenders against the Warriors of Chaos, the front line against the Forces of Chaos. When in reality, in their campaign in both Realms of Chaos and Immortal Empires, you're far better off being the butcher of the Empire. Like, forget Archeon, you're the true endgame crisis. You're the true bringers of the end times, because your best campaign plan is to conquer the Empire en masse, because the territory gives you is far better. The issue with being the defender of the North, well, the issues were twofold. One, the regions of Kislev were not worth a damn. Two, they're difficult to defend because of all the threats. Three, when you're defending is not a smart idea because you don't have the tools needed to succeed in that. Instead, it's always better to take territory, to push the front line back. But the problem for Kislev is that meant going into the Chaos Wastelands, which is either uninhabitable or unpleasant if you're playing Boris Ursus. This is still the case. So, Chaos Wasteland climate is still either unpleasant for Boris Ursus, who literally starts over here in the Tower of Torment in the Chaos Wasteland. Like, this might be frozen climate, but this is a Chaos Wasteland province. And the problem is it's not worth it to fight the campaign as Kislev in either Kislev, let alone the Chaos Wastelands. And that dynamic, I would argue, hasn't changed. But Creative Assembly has done something, and I wish they had communicated it to content creators. Like, I understand not giving us patch notes, right? Because those are not finalized, etc. But it would be nice to have some of these major changes that you're implementing. But what they've done with this patch and what they talked about themselves, they revealed, and I found out at the exact same time that they revealed it, they have added a new commandment. Now, the problem with any new commandment is, of course, you're going to lose the other effects, like the recruitment cost, the income from buildings, etc., etc. But here's what they have done. This new commandment removes the effects of the Chaos Wasteland climate effects. So the magic words of climate change, and this feels like a rush job, at least in terms of naming and all that, but this removes the climate effects. So, at the cost of 5 devotion per turn. For Boris Ursus, this is irrelevant because he gains 4 devotion per turn from every particular from every particular settlement he has in the Chaos Wasteland. So he's certainly earning more devotion than he's going to spend. But what this does is when you activate it, it removes the climate effect. So your income is going to be what it should be. So like if I don't have this on, my income is reduced by 7%. If I look at my initial province, which doesn't have this commandment, you can see that the income from buildings is reduced by 7% over here. Also, the cost of a tier 3 building is 4,600, whereas if I look over here where I do have it available, the cost is reduced as it should be appropriately. Now, here's a limitation of the system. It doesn't work in provinces that have split climate, like the Bloodfire Falls, where Boris Ursus, who is supposed to have a campaign in the Castways, starts. It doesn't work here, because you have that one settlement, which is certainly my capital. It might be because it is my capital that it's not working. It might be because it's the first settlement I took in the province. I couldn't tell you. But I cannot use the commandment over here. So any kind of split province is possibly going to encounter that problem. Now, is this good enough to allow Kislev to fight in the Cast Wastelands? Yes and no. On one hand, it is a major buff to Kislev engaging in war in the Cast Wastelands. To be absolutely clear, it means that you can develop your empire over there, and 5 devotion per province is not going to be significant. You'll learn more than that. You'll learn enough from one single battle potentially to justify. Like if I take my army over here and take Tower of Flies, when the battle, yeah, although he doesn't give me devotion, but devotion from a normal cast faction would be more than enough. Especially demonic factions can like give you 30, 40 per battle. So you're not going to have an issue at a devotion, especially as Boris Ursus. But there's some other issues as well. So the first issue is that you are still going to take attrition on all your armies that aren't Boris Ursus. So your armies traversing the Cast Wastelands will still take a significant amount of damage. 2, it does require that commandment, and it might not work in certain provinces. And since it requires a commandment, it is going to take some time until you conquer the province to make it worth it. Essentially, what I'm saying here is it's not worth fighting the early game, even as Boris Ursus in the Cast Wastelands. It just will not end up working very well for you as a player. It does, however, make it so that if you're currently playing a Kislev campaign, you can finally play a Kislev campaign in Kislev without that being a complete and utter nightmare. So you might still abandon your initial starting position as Boris Ursus and do a migration campaign. You still might conquer portions of the Empire as Katrin, etc. But you also now have the option of just, like, for instance, if you're playing Katrin or Kastaltin, what you end up doing is you deal with your initial issues in Kislev, you take over all of Kislev, and then you start expanding in the Cast Wasteland. But it wouldn't work for every province. So, for instance, I imagine the Mountains Hell wouldn't work, but for the rest of Norska, it would, with the exception of the Vanaheim Mountains. Because there are some frozen territories there, but for the rest of it, you would not have those issues. You'd still have those issues in certain provinces. Those would still not be worth it. But most of the Cast Wastelands would be worth it. Most of Norska would be worth it. So now Kislev actually can play a campaign where they are focusing on being the true bulwark of the North, as they should have been from the very start and from the very implementation. I still think it is the better campaign plan to conquer the Empire, conquer Sylvania, get the gold mines, etc. But at least now you have the possibility of justifying a campaign in the Cast Wastelands. That means more campaign variety, that means more campaign choice, that means more interesting campaigns. That is the net benefit of what Creative Assembly has decided to do over here. It is a welcome development, but I don't think it's quite enough. There are still plenty of issues to improve for Kislev. And keep in mind, you are going to pay, because you're not going to be able to, say, maintain the control. You're not going to be able to get the Awaken the Land in order to get that effect. So bear that aspect in mind. Or if you're playing Boris Ursus, you can certainly use this commandment when you're just constructing buildings. But once those buildings are constructed, you may not necessarily need to worry too much about it, I would argue. Though you probably would have it on all the time. So there is more campaign variety because of it. View it more as a long-term benefit as opposed to a short-term benefit, but it certainly does exist over there. And I would argue it ends up being for a bear because at least you'll have more devotion in your campaigns if you're playing Catherine, Castalton, and yes, of course, Boris Ursus, who already had the most devotion out of all of them anyway. I will also say that this does cement Boris Ursus as the best legendary lord of Kislev by far, even with Mother Estancia. That's all I had to say. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.